The movie starts in 1863. Peter worked as a slave on a cotton farm with his wife Dodian and their children. One day he found out he was going to be sold to a new owner. Before he left, he prayed with his family. When the white men came to take him away, he tried to fight back, but when they threatened his wife, he stopped and went with them. They hit him even though he obeyed. Peter and other slaves were taken in a cage like animals. He promised his crying children he'd come back for them. They were taken to work on building a railroad. Conditions were much worse than on the farm. Slaves who disobeyed were punished severely. They were kept in cages, insulted and beaten by the white masters who used Bible quotes to justify their cruelty. Ferocious dogs were set loose to catch any runaway slaves. If a slave misbehaved, they could be whipped, shot, or even branded on the face by the boss, Vassal. Harrington and Knowles, also once slaves, were Vassal's top men. Knowles became a guard because he was skilled at hunting. Peter tried very hard to be good, but even when he tried to help his friend Gordon when he fell, he got yelled at for doing anything that wasn't work. One evening, after all the people who were forced to work were sent back to where they lived, they had to watch how John was thrown inside while wiggling in pain because of a mark on his cheek. A person named Tomas was very scared, and Peter tried to make him feel better by asking him to think about his family and to think of this as just work. He also talked about God, whom he believed was always watching over them. But John didn't believe in God and made fun of Peter. Peter didn't get angry. He stayed calm and promised to pray for John. Sometime later, Peter heard two guards talking about some very important news. Lincoln had made it so the people who were forced to work were free, and now the ones who could escape were running to Baton Rouge to get help. The conversation was suddenly stopped when a guard noticed Tomas had made a mistake with the food and wanted to punish him, but Peter defended him, saying he was just a kid. The guard hit Peter and pointed a gun at him, ready to kill him for being disrespectful. But another person, Vassal, stopped him because he was interested in Peter's attitude. Later, when Peter was back where he lived, Vassal came to him and said he was like a god to him, and Peter was like a dog now. Peter answered that if that was true, then he should be given the same food as the dogs. Vassal laughed, but the next day he put Peter in chains and made him kneel in front of him while his dog barked and growled at Peter only a few inches away from him. Now the dog remembered Peter's scent. During lunch, Peter told the other slaves about Lincoln and Baton Rouge, which they could get to after walking for 5 days through the swamp. Some slaves were unsure because surviving the swamps was hard, but when Peter reminded them they probably wouldn't survive in this place either. A few men supported him. Now they just needed to wait for the right time to escape. Later, a slave died while working, and the guards made Peter drag him to a pit where they threw all the bodies together. Some white deserters should be digging, but when they saw Peter, they said a black man should do it instead. So Peter grabbed a shovel to fill the pit. Peter saw this as the perfect chance to execute the plan. He waited patiently for the guards to be distracted by an explosion in the field. Then he attacked them with the shovel, stole a knife, and ran away. Other slaves and deserters saw this and started running too, hitting some guards on the way, allowing John to steal a gun. More guards raised the alarm and started shooting the runners, trying to kill as many as possible before they escaped into the woods. Vassal shot at the deserters, but he was angry that Peter got away. He called for Harrington, Knowles, and the dogs to chase after him. Peter teamed up with 3 of his friends and guided them through the forest, listening for any dangers approaching. They found the swamps, and most of the team crossed without trouble. But Tomas froze when he saw the crocodiles, and the dogs caught up with him. After the beasts had done enough damage, Vassal called them back and demanded to know where the group was going. But Tomas refused to answer. This prompted Vassal to offer a deal. If Tomas told him where the others were going, he'd allow him to leave. A terrified Tomas confessed what he knew and was indeed allowed to go into the swamp, but as soon as he turned around, Vassal shot him and let the crocodiles eat him. Meanwhile, Peter, John, and Gordon finished crossing the swamp safely. Peter thought they should take the other swamps, but John wouldn't take orders from anyone, and decided to take the horse trail, feeling like he could stay safe thanks to the gun he stole. Gordon wanted to follow Peter wherever he went, but Peter thought they'd be harder to track if they split up. So Gordon chose his own way through the woods after Peter reminded him to follow the sound of Lincoln's cannons. Afterward, Peter began choosing his own way, only to discover his leg was bleeding because he had been touched by a bullet after all. He needed to do something about it soon, or the dogs would smell the blood. But first he needed to run for a while to put some distance between him and Vassal. Moments later, Peter came across a house owned by a white family that also kept slaves. First, Peter grabbed a vine from a tree to tie above his wound as a tourniquet. Then he sneaked around by staying hidden behind a pile of logs. This allowed him to reach for some water from the pump and to notice the clothes hanging on a rope. Taking a big risk, Peter crossed the garden and stole a shirt before running into the forest. But one of the family kids saw him and alerted everyone by ringing a bell. Fassel heard the noise and followed it to the house, where he was told by the family about the direction Peter took off. Peter was running as fast as possible, only stopping to bandage his wound with the shirt he stole. Moments later, he took the blood-stained shirt off and hid it in a trunk for the dogs to find while he hid under the swamp water. Fassel and his men fell for the trick and made their way down the road thinking Peter had crossed the swamp, but he actually came out after the group was gone. Suddenly, a crocodile took the chance to attack him, so Peter fought fast and pushed it away with a thick branch before killing it with his knife. At that moment, Dodian woke up from a nightmare where she saw her husband in danger. The kids woke up as well and worried about their father, but Dodian promised he was alive, and that he'd come soon because he had survived things no other man could. When night fell, Peter hid on top of a tree and used his knife to remove the swamp leeches from his body, which meant some blood dripped on the plants surrounding him. Meanwhile, Fassel and his men found the dead crocodile and opened it up to find it empty, which meant Peter escaped through here. The group decided to camp for the night and feast on the crocodile, which prompted Harrington to actually compliment Peter for his skill. Fassel immediately scolded him for it, and told him about the lesson his father taught him. If you give black people just a tiny thing, they'll ask for more and take things like their jobs and their lands. The next morning, Peter continued to run while making sure to keep his body covered with mud and animal excrement. It meant he was constantly surrounded by flies, but it helped cover up his scent. When he had to cross another swamp, he thought about his family and prayed to his Lord to keep the fear of the beasts away. And when the sun suddenly shone on him, he took it as a sign. While Fassel split his group to cover more ground, Peter was lucky to find an abandoned treehouse with clean water and some leftover food. There were also some hot coals, so Peter used them to heat up his knife in order to cauterize his leg wound. Afterward, he put the coals on the empty bucket and took them with him as he climbed a tree to throw the smoke at a beehive. This scared the bees away and allowed Peter to take some honey. Fassel saw the smoke and began riding toward it, but Peter was already on his way out. The treehouse also had a boat that a snake was using as its own hiding place. So Peter carefully pushed it away with a branch before jumping into the boat and sailing away as he enjoyed the taste of the honey. In the meantime, Dodian was approached by her master, who told her he had sold her and she would be gone in 2 days. Her children weren't allowed to go with her though because her new master would give her a new husband. Dodian was deeply hurt by the news and still wanted to wait here for her husband to come back. So she took a rather drastic choice to avoid being sold. She went to one of the machines used for the production of cotton and put her hand inside, pretending she was being caught in an accident. Back to Fassel, he found the treehouse thanks to his dog's nose and managed to keep track of Peter's direction while he crossed the river. Peter hurried to make his way into the woods where he was surprised to meet again with John, who was angry because now the white men would come after him as well. Peter swore he wasn't being followed and taught John how to hide his scent, but John ignored him before they started running again. Just a moment later, they heard the dogs barking and hurried to hide. Peter got inside an empty trunk while John climbed up a tree. The dogs managed to follow John's scent anyway, allowing Fassel and his men to easily find him. John refused to come down, so Fassel made him fall with a shot before demanding information on Peter through violent means, but John still wouldn't talk. Fassel decided to take his head and give it to Harrington and Knowles for them to take it back to camp as a message. After waiting a few hours to put some distance between himself and Fassel, Peter came out of the trunk when it started to rain, only to discover exactly how they killed John, which shook him to his core. He forced himself to keep going with grief heavy on his mind, until suddenly he saw a bunch of horses running by, including one on fire. Peter followed the direction they came from and found a house on a plantation, but everything was on fire, and all the white people were dead. It seemed the slaves here also heard the news from Lincoln, and took matters into their own hands. With his knife out just in case, Peter entered the house and slowly walked through the rooms until he came across the dining table, instantly throwing all caution to the wind and jumping on the food and wine to feed his tired body. He didn't stop until he heard a weird noise coming from upstairs, and he followed it until he found a dying girl stuck under a harp that she kept playing as a plea for help. Peter immediately rescued her and took her outside, where he put her down on a table before trying to fetch some water. The girl was scared though and made him stay as she gave him her cross pendant, and Peter took it, understanding what she needed. A prayer promising God was with her. He was so distracted that he didn't hear Harrington approaching until it was too late, and Peter had to drop his knife and step away from the girl if he didn't want to get shot. The girl died as soon as Peter left her, and he was so furious that he dared to violently turn around and kill Harrington by using the cross as a stake. At that moment, Knowles also arrived, but Peter thought fast and grabbed Harrington's weapon to shoot him. Knowles tried to explain to Peter that someone capable of killing a crocodile may be accepted by Fassel in his ranks. But Peter called him the worst kind and left him to die. Hearing Fassel approach because of the barking, Peter decided to run into the cotton fields for cover, and when the dog came too close he shot it. Fassel eventually came across the body, which made him even more determined to catch Peter. The next morning, Peter arrived at a beach filled with the bodies of white men who died during the confrontations against Lincoln's army. Unfortunately, they didn't have any provisions for him to take, but in the distance, Peter could see the ships and hear the cannons that indicated Lincoln's men were near. Excited at the thought of finally reaching freedom, Peter began running again, but suddenly a horse appeared by his side and he was pushed to the ground with a few hits. It was Fassel, who offered Peter some of the meat he had asked for back in the cage, and asked him to beg. Since Peter wouldn't obey, Fassel took out his gun and reminded Peter he was his god. But before he could pull the trigger, someone else shot him first. Peter told the falling body that he was no god before turning to meet his saviors, who were Lincoln's native guard led by Lieutenant Caillou. Peter's body finally gave in to exhaustion and hunger, so the soldiers took him to the infirmary tent on their camp in Baton Rouge. Because his leg wound was infected, the numb nurse made Peter rest, and for a few days Peter did nothing but dream about his family. Once Peter was feeling better, he saw one of the soldiers to get his new papers as a free man, although he had to make up some information he didn't know, like his age. Unfortunately, he wasn't allowed to leave and search for his family yet. The white soldiers were taking advantage of the fact the slaves were technically stolen contraband, and gave them two choices. They could work on the federal farms or join the army. Peter refused to keep following orders, but when the soldier pointed out that joining the army could help him rescue his family and be free for good, Peter accepted to join. Later, Peter found out that the army found Gordon too. Gordon was hurt, but he was alive. Peter felt happy to see him, but it was hard for him to tell Gordon about John. Then Peter went to Caillou to get his uniform. But first they asked if he wanted to help by posing for something called a photograph. Peter was cautious, but Caillou said the white photographers were harmless and had good intentions. These men were taking pictures to show the truth about slavery to the world. Peter agreed to show his back to the camera, revealing the scars from many whippings. After that, Peter went to see the general. The general asked him for information about the enemy's railroad. Peter shared all the information he had. The general looked at his picture and said those scars meant disobedience, which wasn't good for a soldier. Caillou tried to take Peter away, but Peter defended himself, saying those scars meant he had been beaten many times but never stopped fighting, which was important for a soldier. At dawn, Caillou took Peter and his soldiers to the trenches. He reminded them they were fighting for freedom with a heartfelt speech. Many soldiers were shot by the enemy while they were marching, but they kept going and joined the fight without hesitation. Soon there was fire all around them. Peter was hit by an explosion and knocked unconscious for a few minutes. When he woke up, he kept helping, shooting at the enemy whenever he could and offering blessings to dying comrades. Caillou died in battle, and Peter found a wounded Gordon. Seeing his friend in pain and fear inspired him to run toward the enemy lines. His goal was to stop the cannons. With soldiers following him, the native guard defeated the enemy and won the battle. After the war, the army visited every plantation to free the slaves. When they arrived at the plantation where Peter used to work, everyone was shocked at first, not believing the news. But they soon realized that freedom was real and felt happy. After seeing his former master die for his crimes, Peter looked for his family. He almost had a breakdown when he couldn't find them. But when he quietly prayed, he saw his wife and kids running towards him for a hug. The real photograph of Peter became famous worldwide. In 1863, thanks to Lincoln's proclamation, over 400,000 black people escaped to freedom. By 1865, nearly 4 million slaves in America were recognized as free.